He was moving around the room, offering toasts to each of the participants and offering them in English, which surprised me a great deal. It surprised the Russians, too, because the only people outside of myself who understood English were some Western ambassadors, 3 or 4, who were in attendance. None of the Russians could understand one word of what Joe was saying. They had to get it through an interpreter. Mikoyan finally spoke up and said, "Joe, why don't you speak Russian? You speak Russian perfectly well." Joe said, very snappily, "Why don't you speak Chinese?" Mikoyan said, "It's a very difficult language." "Oh," said Joe, "it's not that difficult. Come around to the Chinese embassy tomorrow morning and we'll start giving you lessons." About that time, one of the security men moved me away from my vantage point where I was listening in on this insight into the actual top relations. My impression was of Joe that he was a brilliant diplomat. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was needling the Russians, and the Russians didn't quite know how to respond to it.
After completing land reform, Mao took a further step to improve life in the villages. He believed a real communist society could not be realized without abolishing the private ownership of land.
In 1957, Mao Zedong launched the most radical experiment in his whole career, the turning of China into a total system of communes. At one stroke of the pen, he ordered all Chinese peasants to abandon their individual farms and join together in communes, which would be the pure form originally envisaged by Karl Marx. Nothing like this had been done in the Soviet Union under collectivization, none under any of the other communist forms of government. Within a matter of months, hundreds of millions of Chinese peasants were herded into these communes where they had to give up their personal possessions. They even had communal dining halls, all ate together. They did have their own rice bowls and chopsticks, but that was just about all. In fear that the government would seize everything they had, many of them sold their clothes, they slaughtered their animals such as they had, and they were right in this, because before long the government was tearing down even their peasant huts and using that timber to build communal halls where they would all live in a form of barracks. Naturally, it had a radical effect upon the peasants and on their life and on their production. The product of the communes was far less than that had been done by individual peasant farmers. Of all of Mao's disasters, this one undoubtedly was the worst.
In 1958, Mao introduced his Great Leap Forward program. Under the plan, large-scale public works, including irrigation and dam construction, began. The masses were deployed to implement these plans. The aim of the Great Leap Forward was to have China move into the ranks of the great powers. Mao said, "By deploying the masses, it is not impossible to surpass England in 15 years. He encouraged everyone to set up backyard steel mills to boost China's steel production.
No policy which Mao ever attempted had less reason and more sheer insanity in it than his policy of attempting to make a great steel-producing nation out of China through setting up backyard steel mills. The idea was for each farm, every farmer, to turn his attention to making steel in small round pots in his backyard. The farmers had nothing to make steel with. They threw into the pot their farm utensils, their plows, their axes, their hammers. Some of them even tore steel roofs out of houses in order to make this very low quality steel. And within a matter of months, 90 million people in China were engaged in this fantastic production, which was a total waste of time, energy, and assets. The result of it was a terrible disaster, a famine, because the farmers had to leave their crops unsown and even unharvested while they were busily engaged in making useless steel, which had to be thrown away. And in the end, they didn't even have the implements to go back to the fields the next spring, because they'd all gone into the pot in this effort by Mao to exceed the Great Britain's steel production within 14 years. At the end of it, there was a political and economic crisis in China. The Chinese, whose opinions I respect, believe that there are two Maos. The first one is the Mao up until the mid-50s. This was the great Mao, a man with an absolute ear for revolution, great achievements, great accomplishments. Then there is the Mao after the mid-50s, the period when he steadily went down, down, down until, in the end, he became unspeakable. I would like to know how he got off the track. We start out with a Mao who was a philosophical rebel, a rebel against obvious neglect of his country, and in his own person, he was, in those times, morally correct. He was thoughtful, and he was moral.
Harrison Salisbury has been to China 10 times. The purpose of this trip is to gain a perspective on the People's Republic in view of its 40 years history. To accomplish this task, Salisbury thinks, it is necessary to review the metamorphosis of Mao Zedong.
In the early days of the People's Republic, Mao was not a one-man dictator. He worked with his colleagues and they got along quite well. It was only when economic and social problems began to increase that he more and more inclined to go it alone. The first sign of that, I think, came in 1956 when he decreed what was called let the 100 flowers bloom. He encouraged intellectuals to express their views, and then when they did, clamped down, fired them. Many of them were executed or went into camps. But the very important watershed was the Great Leap Forward. This was a rickety plan of economic and social advance, which Mao put into effect really on his own. Backyard steel mills, communes, and when his colleagues disapproved, he went ahead anyway. And from then on, more and more, it was Mao on his own, and if his colleagues objected, they paid for the objection, usually with their lives or a long term of imprisonment.
Those who were thought of as the right wing or party opponents were re-educated at the reform through labor camps. In 1956, Mao introduced a program known as Let 100 Flowers Bloom, Let 100 Schools of Thought Contend. He called for the Chinese people to speak their mind